can think of no better reason. It's nice to leave it with a laugh today. Guys, thank you so much for getting up with us today. Thank you all for, Ryan and Des, for your honesty and your candor today. A special edition of First Take is coming up next. They will dedicate the entire 2 hours to talking about the events of yesterday. Have a wonderful day. We'll see you tomorrow.
The world awaits out of Minneapolis. There is a verdict that has come in from the Derek Chauvin trial.
Derek Chauvin guilty on all 3 counts in the killing of George Floyd.
Today was a good day for African Americans.
Is it going to change anything?
We're going to hold you accountable no matter who you are.
It's a great time to reflect and see how far we've come in the last year.
Gives hope and precedence for these type of verdicts to be the norm.
I would love for this to be the last time, but it ain't going to be. And so what do we do next? How do we deal with this next?
Good morning and welcome into a special edition of First Take. Today we will discuss the verdict that will echo through time, the verdict where the real work begins. Stephen A. Smith, Max Kellerman, I'm Molly Karen Rose. Let's get right into it, gentlemen. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin found guilty on all charges in the murder of George Floyd. Chauvin was found guilty of second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, second-degree manslaughter by a jury Tuesday for his role in the murder of Floyd last May. Floyd's death in the video, which showed Chauvin kneeling on Floyd's neck for about 9 minutes, became a catalyst for the sports world's racial and social justice movement last summer. Chauvin faces a 40-year maximum sentence for the second-degree unintentional murder conviction, a 25-year sentence for the third-degree murder, and a 10-year sentence for second-degree manslaughter. A jury of 6 white, 4 black, 2 multiracial jurors deliberated for 10.5 hours over parts of 2 days before rendering a verdict. Stephen A., your reaction to this historic verdict?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that while I understand why people are in a very celebratory mood, I am not one of those people. George Floyd is not coming back. He's dead. He was killed by this officer. He'll never be around his family or his loved ones again. He's not coming home. And so because of that, for me, while I understand why people would be in the streets in Minneapolis and beyond celebrating, I'm just not of that mindset. I do love the fact that the sentences came down, that he was found guilty on all charges. I did love seeing his family celebrate, because my heart goes out to them and what they've had to endure over the last year and what they'll have to endure forever going on with their lives without George Floyd in it, at least physically. So we all know that. And while I'm glad for them because they seemed incredibly happy with what transpired, we also understand what comes along with it for them. So whatever way they feel, they are entitled to whatever emotions that they have. And all of us, I think, easily supports them in that regard. With that being said, I'm paying attention to the particulars, and what I would implore everybody is not to take their eyes off the ball. It's incredibly important that we understand what transpired yesterday. Derek Chauvin was convicted. Unintentional second-degree murder, third-degree murder, manslaughter charges. It says 40, 25, and 10 years respectively. That adds up to 75 years. From my understanding, the sentencing, his time in jail will be served concurrently, not consecutively. So what people out there may not understand, some people may not understand, and for the purposes of my opening comment, Max and Molly, I think it's important to explain to people that may not understand. When you are sentenced and your sentence is to be exercised consecutively, that means every charge is separate. And you have to serve one charge. And then after that, you have to serve time for the other charge. And then after that, you got to serve time for the other charge. When it's concurrent, it's perceived as being one crime. Essentially, you might have been found guilty for the 3 charges, but because they're served concurrently, you only get one. You're only being penalized for one charge. Now, I've read reports, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I was reading one report from the Associated Press. They said obviously the prosecution is going to go for the stiffest penalty imaginable, and the stiffest charge is obviously the second-degree unintentional murder, which carries a 40-year sentence. Well, in the state of Minnesota, doing my research and looking stuff like that up, lo and behold, you hear stuff along the lines that says, okay, well, that basically means the judge will give him 20. You're also in the state of Minnesota, because it's a federal crime, it's not a state crime. Since it's a state crime, not a federal crime, I'm sorry. Okay, not only do you get the 20, but in all likelihood, you only serve 2/3 of that time. So we're talking about anywhere from 10 to 12 years, conceivably, that Derek Chauvin could end up spending in jail. Because remember, he's left it up to the discretion of the judge. It's at the judge's discretion what amount of time this individual, Derek Chauvin, ends up getting sentenced to. The judge could give him the stiffest penalty imaginable, or he could cut it in half. And ultimately, usually in the state of Minnesota, they say you only serve 2/3 of it. We got dudes that was dealing marijuana that spent more time, more than 10 years in jail. And this dude might end up getting something like that. So it's incredibly important that we understand that everybody's eyes need to be on the ball. Yeah, he was found guilty. And that's step one. Justice appears to have been served. I lean more along the lines of what LeBron James tweeted when he brought up the word accountability. Because you're talking about true accountability and not being able to wiggle your way around it. Even when he goes to jail, everybody says he ain't got nothing to worry about. Ain't nobody going to get at him because they ain't going to put him in general population. I mean, you hear all kinds of stuff. So I'm kind of wondering, okay, what's going to really happen here? My eyes on the judge. Because now that he has been found guilty by the jury, I want to see what the judge is going to do as it pertains to his sentencing. Because if you sentence that man to 10 years, 12 and a half years, 20 years, it's your discretion. In the state of Minnesota, they usually serve about 2/3 of their sentence if they had no previous criminal record, which he did not. And he was a police officer. These are the kind of things we have to pay attention to, because on far too many occasions, particularly as black people, and we have every right to feel this way because we've endured so much throughout our history, symbolic victories, while significant, which is something that Max has pointed out accurately so, in the past, I'm saying it's not enough anymore. Symbolism, symbolic gestures, symbolic victories, it ain't enough. This man has to pay. He should be in jail for the rest of his natural life. Those 3 officers, one that kept the spectators at bay, the other 2 that assisted even though they didn't have their knee on George Floyd's neck, but they was holding down his body. They need to do jail time too. Their trials come up in August. I'm looking at all of that. And I'm looking at the judge, who also during the trial, because Representative Maxine Waters showed up this week and flew from the nation's capital to Minneapolis and essentially encouraged people. She didn't say violence or anything like that, but she was encouraging people to make noise and to be confrontational. The judge was on the record and said to the defense, you obviously have grounds for an appeal to completely, for a mistrial, to completely dismiss all of these charges. That's what the judge said. And this is the same judge that has the discretion of deciding whether or not this man serves the maximum amount of time or the minimal amount of time. These are the things that I'm looking at. So again, I'm very happy with the guilty verdict. It was necessary. I'm glad it happened. But that's only part 1. Part 2 is what I'm talking about. And part 3 is people not forgetting that before George Floyd was killed, was murdered, there was a kid, a white kid, that went into a church in South Carolina, shot 9 people, killed them while they were in prayer. The police, after a nationwide manhunt, got him, stopped him at Burger King for some food before bringing him to jail alive and cuffed. George Floyd passes away after. Somebody else shows up in Colorado who wasn't black, kills 10 people. Somehow he was arrested. But Dante Wright is killed. after George Floyd. Before George Floyd, after George Floyd. These things still happen. They're still happening. Let us not take our eyes off the ball. Let us address policing and criminal justice reform. Let's make sure we keep our eyes on the judge who has the discretion of making this maximum or minimum. The job is not finished.
Yep.
It's not finished.
Stephen A., I just want to add one thing to the sentiment you just said. If he was to serve just around 12 years, he's 45 years old. So he would be out in his 50s and have his whole life ahead of him. And he's currently in administrative segregation. So he is being protected right now at this point. Max, go ahead.
I want to actually start by directing this towards, I want to talk to white people who may not get it. White people who don't get it right now. This was an open and shut case. It was an open and shut case. There were eyewitnesses and incontrovertible video evidence unequivocally of a murder, open and shut case. And it came back with a just and really the only reasonable conclusion and verdict that could have been arrived at in this case, right? It's the only one. And yet, do you believe that had this not taken place against the backdrop of a global pandemic and then resulted in nationwide protests, that justice would have necessarily been served like that? Because there are countless, and Stephen A. listed some recent ones, examples of police brutality directed toward black people in this country when the police got off. So I would say the reason this time was different, and this is directed to everybody now, the reason this time was different is because people, black people led, but a lot of people of goodwill and socially conscious people followed and supported, insisted on their voices being heard. They insisted in the streets, nationwide protests, and at the ballot box. Now, what's the result been? There's usually a backlash, right? Here we have a proper and just verdict. It was arrived at quickly. It's the only one that could have possibly reasonably been arrived at. And yet it's cause for celebration, as Stephen A. points out, among many, because it's like, oh my God, we got justice? The reaction has been an effort by the forces of injustice to suppress the vote at the ballot box. See Georgia, where, well, no, it expands access. Well, yeah, to people in rural areas, less, but it restricts to people in urban areas is the upshot. So that's at the ballot box. But also even in the streets. Stephen A., as I'm sure you're aware, state legislatures now are introducing all kinds of bills designed to be anti-protest, designed to make it more difficult to protest, in certain respects almost criminalize protest, not as a reaction to the attempted insurrection at our Capitol by many white supremacists, but as a reaction to largely lawful protests in our streets, which were a reaction to injustice. So I would say that this was a good and just verdict, and there is reason, Stephen A., I think, for people to celebrate today, and there's also reason to be circumspect, as you point out, in the celebration. I just like to add one more thing. I have noticed some people with good intentions tweeting things out that they believe are supporting the cause of justice. And there's been a big backlash. It's tone deaf, it's insensitive. And I would just say that people should, in this moment, determine, is this person at least trying to be an ally? And kind of edit the response to those people
give some grace
in a way that's instructive and constructive instead of divisive and destructive.
I agree with you there.
Let me just add one thing really quickly here, Stephen A. Give me 1 second. Max, when you mentioned the fact, would this have happened without the backdrop of the pandemic? I just want to add, would there have been justice if Darnella Frazier, the 17-year-old, did not film him murdering Floyd? Absolutely not. So that's a key point we need to mention here. We had this on video. Stephen A., go ahead.
Well, I'm glad you
Molly
brought up
and Stephen A., may I really quickly, because just to add to that point, it'll take 10 seconds. I now have my eye on, guys, state legislatures. I want to see what kind of bill is going to come up that limits or attempts to people recording these kind of interactions, because my antenna are up, and I believe that could be next.
Darnella Frazier, you brought her up. Molly deserves flowers from all of us. If she had not videotaped, stood there at 17 years old, if she had not stood there and videotaped that police officer, Derek Chauvin, doing what he did, he might have gotten off. We might have never known the severity of his actions, how egregious his actions were. And at 17, and a young lady to do that, I just can't say enough about her. That's number one. Number two, Max Kellerman, like I told you, we don't get on networks. We don't do that on this show. I'm very, very big on that. But there's nothing wrong with calling out particular individuals, okay, even if they are at another network. And I'm about to do that right now for a second, to piggyback right off of what you just said in terms of being responsible and being humane in regards to what happened and what you saw happen. Okay, I've been on CNN, I've been on MSNBC, I've been on various networks, I've obviously been on Fox News. I know the Mark Levins and the Sean Hannitys of the world and all of that stuff, and I disagree with a lot of things people say about them, and I disagree with some things that they say, but I still communicate with them. Okay, I'm a fan of the show The Five. I'm a fan of Neil Cavuto and others. Tucker Carlson is an entirely different matter altogether. And I'm not going to engage in name calling or anything like that. That would be inappropriate and unnecessary and unfair to him. But what I will say, when you literally intimate that the jury found Derek Chauvin guilty because they were afraid, okay, essentially of riots taking place and things of that nature, you just wonder sometimes if this is the kind of things that leads to the divisiveness that we're talking about. Because the video is there for all of us to see. I mean, you saw folks on both sides of the aisle talking about this police officer and how egregious his actions were. Matter of fact, I think I heard Tucker Carlson saying that one time. This was egregious, et cetera, et cetera. Yet last night, he's talking about how there's people on the jury that probably found him guilty because, you know, they were afraid. I don't have the direct quote in front of me, but I saw it and I read it to make sure that I saw what I read and I read what I saw. And you just wonder sometimes, these are the kind of things that make people shake and make people shiver, because you realize that in the face of such obvious, flagrant evidence, conspicuous evidence, there's still going to be somebody that opens the subject to debate when there are certain things that are simply not debatable. We saw what Derek Chauvin did. Saw it. The world saw it. There were protests all over the world because of what happened to George Floyd. And yet he goes on national television last night.
Such thing as guilty. This was so obvious. This was so heinous. There was so much change took place after that, and the evidence to me, I just thought, was overwhelming. What could possibly constitute a guilty verdict going forward if this one didn't?
How did you feel, Howard, and welcome to the show as always, my brother. How did you feel when you saw folks, particularly in our community, celebrating the verdict? What did you feel from seeing the celebrations of the actual verdict?
Do you want me to tell you what I felt, or do you want me to tell you what I should say? Because I'll tell you, Stephen A.
I always want to know what you really feel. You know me.
I hated it. I understood it. I hated it. And it reminded me of Jackie Robinson, to be honest, back when they finally in one of the stadiums took down the colored bleachers, and they took down the colored entrances, and everybody was cheering, and he was saying, "Don't cheer. All you're getting is what you deserve. All you're getting is what is owed to you. This is the basic." And to me, when I saw people cheering, I understood the release. I understood the pain. I understood the impulse. But I also understood that what they were really saying was, there's no scenario where we are going to feel comfortable in the hands of the justice system, and that this required celebration, because in the back of everyone's mind, people were gearing up for an acquittal. And that was painful to me. And I say that with the utmost respect and also with an amazing amount of pain, because you know that's what people were thinking. What's going to happen if this verdict comes back not guilty?
And in this case, against the backdrop of a global pandemic, eyewitnesses, and probably most importantly, incontrovertible video evidence, all of that combined got the only reasonable verdict. But I want to read you, I'm sure you've seen this, the initial statement that in Minneapolis after the incident was, man dies after medical incident during police interaction. So had there not been a video, Molly brought this up in the last segment, what would have happened? And is it time to start looking through these kind of reports every time man dies in police interaction, if they're already cuffed and restrained? How do you start determining, in fact, no, actually that was murder without that video evidence?
Yeah, well, this is what was happening. Everybody thought, remember, Max, Stephen A., we're old enough to remember Rodney King, and we remember what was happening before Rodney King, when people would say, well, if there was only video evidence. Then finally you saw video evidence, and people said, well, we don't know what happened before the video. So there's always been a dispensation that's been given to police, and I think it's also, this is the nature of the business as well. From a media standpoint, you know, when you cover cops, where do we get our information? You get your information directly from police. So most of your news coverage stems from their lens from the very start. It's a very tilted situation. And so from an information gathering standpoint, they're always going to get the benefit of the doubt. But this is also one of the reasons why people are looking for alternatives. This is the reason why people look at these situations and you say that these models are now broken, that these models have been broken for a very long time. And at some point, you don't know what that flashpoint is going to be, but there has to be a flashpoint, and maybe this was it.
What were you feeling like prior to the verdict? What were you anticipating was going to transpire, Howard?
Well, there's so many different areas. I think from a straight verdict standpoint, I was thinking, like I think a lot of us think, which is there going to be some way to handle an acquittal, to handle a not guilty? How on earth could you square this? How do you reconcile this? I think that was one of the big questions for me, which is because this is not a corner turning moment, in my opinion, because look at everything else that you have going on right now. You just had you've got the Chicago video, you've got Dante Wright, you've got the 16-year-old, the Bryant girl. And so you have all of these different things happening right now. So I don't view this as a big turning point. But I was thinking that from a baseline standpoint, just a baseline, that this shouldn't have been a conversation that really does tell you how far apart we are and how far things need to go, that there was even the slightest idea that there was going to be an injustice here.
Howard, we are a sports network, and so there's a tendency to kind of shoehorn sports in. In this case, however, reacting to this news, I do think that it's fair to look at sports and the role that athletes played, leadership role that athletes played in directing attention here. You know, the shut up and dribble came about because athletes seem to me to be saying, largely led by African-American athletes, wait a minute, you want us to entertain you. We've made it because it's, but now you want us to entertain you. We're not getting back to normal until there's more of a new normal that's actually normal. It seemed to me there was real influence there. What's your assessment of the role that athletes and sports played in this moment?
Well, I think that more than anything else, you always view sports through the lens of labor. And you think about this from the standpoint that the players took the initiative last year in a way that they didn't. You know, this reminds me of going back to Donald Sterling. In that when you go back to Donald Sterling in 2014, the players chose to stay within the system. They chose to trust Adam Silver. They chose to believe that the institution was going to take care of them in that regard. In this regard, we saw last year the players have now shown they're willing to not play. they're willing to walk out. And I think about this now that we've been almost a year next month from this. Imagine if the players said this wasn't our issue. Imagine if the players kept playing and said, well, we don't get involved in politics, so this is not our fight. Imagine how different this would have looked, both in terms of their reputations and also what it would have done nationally. And I think that the big thing is, more importantly, is I think sports has there's a spot there where the players realize what kind of influence they have. And I was wondering what they were going to do in a not guilty verdict in terms of if they were going to question their influence. It tells me once more that it seems so silly, but it's not silly when you go back 3-4 years and you go back to you can't just take a knee. Clearly you can. Clearly what the players were doing, all of those players who came out and said, you got to have real action. You can't just protest. Well, clearly they proved that the action of protest is enough. It moves things, and it also moves opposition when you're looking at the number of anti-protest regressive legislation that's taking place across the country. They had influence. They did make something happen here.
Yeah, I just want to mention something really quickly before I ask you a question. When you mentioned Colin Kaepernick, it's still so eerie to me when you think about the symbolism of Colin Kaepernick taking a knee and how George Floyd was murdered, also with the knee on his neck. So staying with the sports subject, I want to get your thoughts, though, Howard, on a tweet by the Raiders and see what you think of this. So the Raiders created a little bit of controversy yesterday with this tweet after the Chauvin verdict saying, "I can breathe," with the date 4/20/21. Owner Mark Davis took responsibility for the tweet and does not plan to delete it. Howard, your take on that?
Well, I thought it was ignorant. I thought at first glance, I thought maybe there was an ignorance taking place there, not realizing that in 2014, in December 2014, following the death of Eric Garner, there were protests, there were counter protests by police and former police officers wearing T-shirts that said, "I can breathe," which were trolling Eric Garner and trolling his family and trolling the athletes who were wearing "I can't breathe" T-shirts. So to give Mark Davis the benefit of the doubt, I was thinking, well, maybe he's not aware that that's what the I can breathe phrase comes from. But then I was thinking, you just can't be this ignorant. And now that you know, and now you see how insensitive it is, this is just another example of this battle. This is the reason why, in some ways, you have the players asserting themselves against ownership, and why the players have to have some form of vigilance in a lot of ways, because they're not just countering what's happening out there. Sometimes they're countering their own employers.
Well, my response to that is I completely agree with Howard if that were the case. I was under the impression, I did not know, I didn't even look at this story. I just heard about it late last night, and somebody said that he wore the T-shirt as a result of the verdict. In other words, we can breathe now. We got the guilty verdict that we were all looking for. Yeah. That's what was told to me. I'm saying if that was his intent, then I don't take offense to it to that degree. But if it's what you say, if I've misinterpreted that, and it's something along the lines of what you're saying, then there's every reason to be offended by him wearing that T-shirt, without question. I just didn't know. No. I didn't know anything about the story. Yeah.
Yeah, and I thought it was the same. I said, if you're giving him the benefit of the doubt, what he's really saying is, okay, we can exhale. But right. You have to know the backstory of what that phrase means.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, even if the intent was meant to be positive, it shows a lack of awareness, clearly. Go ahead, Max.
I was referring to that in the previous segment. That's what I think it's important. If what you say, Howard, is true, and he's on the sly giving a wink to the opposition to "I can't breathe," that's unacceptable. But it was my impression
I'm not saying that
what he was saying is, look, I'm showing some. Well, I'm just saying, if he's trying to show solidarity, even if it's clumsy or uninformed in certain ways or tone deaf, I think it's important that a lot of the cries from the opposition, from the forces of injustice, call people with social conscience the quote-unquote woke mob. And it's important if you want to defang that, then you can't join that. In other words, it's one thing to direct ire toward people of bad will, but people of goodwill who maybe need to have a kind of a teaching or a learning moment and aren't fully aware of all the issues, I don't like the idea of directing the ire of the mob toward them. I much prefer the idea of educating and sensitizing and bringing them further into the fold.
Well, then he's educated now. He knows what the phrase means. If he doesn't know, if he's watching this, then he should know now. Take it down and change it to "we can breathe now, finally," or something like that. By being defiant like this, you just look like you don't care. And so you make it about you. Clearly, that phrase means something over the last 7 years of what's been taking place here. So now that you know, fix it. It's really not that complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, don't double down. I totally understand what you're saying. Howard Bryant, thank you so much. Always appreciate your time and perspective.
No, my pleasure. Thank you all.
Mark Davis and the tweet that he put out, "I can breathe," with the date 4/20/21. He was asked if he was aware of the Eric Garner situation, and he said he was not. And he was not aware that people were wearing "I can't breathe" T-shirts after. He said it's a learning moment and he has more research to do. So I just want to make sure to put that out there with Raiders owner Mark Davis. But joining us now is renowned director and filmmaker Spike Lee. Spike, thank you so much for being here with us this morning. Always an honor to have you, sir, and bringing a little levity to a heavy day with your Knicks gear, at least in my opinion.
Well, I'm going to the game tonight.
I'll start initially. Good. Glad to hear. Staying loyal, staying consistent. What was your initial reaction to the verdict, Spike?
Well, as a sports fan, I've come to learn that you can't do your end zone dance, so I did not know where it was going to go. I was hoping the verdict turned out the way it did. But I think that we cannot forget about it's up to the judge for the sentencing. So it's not over. And then I found out this morning about a young sister. Her name is Ma'Khia Bryant, 16 years old. And I'm going to say it, was murdered by the police in Columbus, Ohio, a short time before the verdict came down in Minneapolis. So what does that tell us? The continuation of the attacks on black and brown bodies in this United States of America. Yesterday. So I think a lot of people like myself did not know about this, what happened yesterday in Columbus, Ohio. 16 years old. Now the report is she had a knife and was in a beef with two other women. But what is a taser for? I mean, they got it all mixed up. When they're supposed to use a taser, they use a gun instead.
And then they use a gun and swear that they thought it was a taser. So don't get me started with that. But I'll
yes,
I'll
I mean, it's different. One's black, one's yellow. You're supposed to put the taser on your side that's not dominant, and the Glock, whatever, is on the side you're dominant. So that whole, it's crazy.
I started off the show, Spike, bringing attention. I always appreciate you on the show, bro. I started off the show.
Anytime.
I started off the show by saying I appreciate people who feel good that the guilty verdicts came in, but I'm not in a celebratory mood, number one, because George Floyd is dead. He ain't coming back. He doesn't get to hang with his family, spend time with everybody, his loved ones and all that stuff. But number two, the discretion of the judge is what I'm paying attention to. Because since the sentences is a state crime, not federal, and the sentences are scheduled to be served concurrently as opposed to consecutively, it all gets lumped in as one crime. So basically, you're instead of getting the 40 and the 25 and the 10 years, which adds up to 75 years, the prosecution has to go for the stiffest penalty imaginable, which is only 40 years. Since it's up to the discretion of the judge, he can easily make it 20 because, again, this police officer didn't have a criminal record And in the state of Minnesota, those who usually don't find themselves in that situation. And then even then, of the 20 years, you only have to serve about 2/3, which comes up to about 12 and a half. This dude can end up out of jail in the next decade if this judge doesn't bring down the hammer. So that's where my focus lies. Where does your focus lie, Spike? Where does your focus lie?
My brother, I think I said that in the opening that I'm not doing any end zone dance, and I said that the judge is going to be the sole person to determine the length of the sentence. So I agree with you that this thing is not over. And also, like you said, he's not going to be able to see his daughter grow up. High school graduation, college, walk his daughter down the aisle. You know, it's gone. And this country's in bad shape. But I love the speech by the president and the vice president post verdict yesterday, and I just hope that we got to get this thing, we got to get it right. And it's not going to take overnight. This is like 400 years of this, plus 400 years, and we just got to, keep fighting the good fight.
Spike, I just mentioned to our previous guest, Howard Bryant, that we're a sports network, so a lot of times we try to shoehorn sports into this stuff. But in this case, athletes, especially African-American athletes, really did take a leadership role and seem to bring about change. The protests in the streets, they didn't play a game after another incident and were told to shut up. LeBron was told to shut up and dribble, but he didn't. And it doesn't escape my attention that in the 60s and 70s, there were athletes like Muhammad Ali and Bill Russell and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Jim Brown and others who took that kind of role during a time of great social upheaval and change. And today,
I think
we're seeing
add Kurt Flood to that too.
A similar thing.
Let's add Kurt Flood.
What's that?
Add Kurt Flood.
So I'm just curious about your, certainly Kurt Flood. All these athletes are getting paid because of Kurt Flood.
Yes.
So your impression of the kind of leadership role that LeBron James and other high-profile athletes, including athletes in the WNBA, have taken that has, whether or not this marks some kind of watershed moment for change and progress, but it did result, at least in this case, in a just verdict.
Yes, and I got to give love to my brother LeBron, who took the lead, and I think that we're in a different era. This is people who grew up with hip-hop, grew up with, Public Enemy and others. So they're less fearful than the athletes in the other generations, and they're not going to take it. And the NBA, I think, is much more progressive than the other leagues, especially the NFL, the No Freedom League. It's no coincidence. I got my man Colin, behind me. So they're discovering that they have power, they have a voice, and they're going to utilize it. And I love it. I love it. I love it. And I applaud them. Keep doing it. Keep doing it.
Is there anything specific that you think the sports world, the athletes in particular, should do from here? I only ask that question because for me, what I think about, Spike, is the fact that when you have the leagues, meaning the owners, the respective commissioners, etc., collaborating with you to make change, obviously because they recognize your cachet and your impact as professional athletes in this day and age. So considering that, I'm thinking they can continue to march forward and try to manipulate legislation to some degree, just like lobbyists do on Capitol Hill. What specifically do you think they should do going from here, moving forward?
Well, I think that one thing they can do is really put the efforts of support for this George Floyd bill.
Yes.
Get by. And another thing, and I want to say, I want to thank you guys for reaching out. Anytime you want me to speak, if I'm available to do it. I think, and Dwayne Wade and guys buying pieces of stock, ownership, 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 ownership. Let's get one of my favorite musicals, Hamilton. You got to be in the room. If we're not in the room, it's not a good look. So ownership, ownership, ownership. If you're in the room, you got to say.
Can I say this before we end this segment, everybody? I appreciate Max, Molly. I appreciate Spike bringing that up because it did not escape me, and I'm not trying to cast any aspersions on anybody. But I think about Shaquille O'Neal with the Orlando Magic, with the Los Angeles Lakers. Yet, in order to get an ownership stake, he had to go to Sacramento. I think about D. Wade and all that he's meant to Miami. He had to go to Utah to get an ownership stake. That stuff did not escape me one bit. And
me either.
When Spike brings that up, because you got a lot of these guys that have done an awful lot for franchises, yet they have to go elsewhere to get an ownership stake in a franchise because the franchise that they represented obviously didn't want to give them a piece of the action when all was said and done.
Can I say this real quick to get back on you? Dwayne Wade, Utah.
Yes.
I don't know what happened between him and Mickey, whatever, but that don't sound right. I'm glad he has a piece of Utah Jazz, Shaq in Sacramento, but those aren't their teams.
Yeah. Yeah, it was called Wade County for a reason. And just looking again, you mentioned Colin Kaepernick, the picture behind you. It's hard to believe that was 5 years ago. And so many people didn't understand why he kneeled. Hopefully that picture is becoming a bit clearer now. And this verdict is the beginning of change. It's definitely not justice, but hopefully it's some accountability. Spike Lee, always an honor. Thank you so much. Enjoy the game tonight.
Yeah.
Number 8 in a row tonight.
All right, let's go. Former President Barack Obama with these thoughts. Today, a jury did the right thing, but true justice requires much more. Michelle and I send our prayers to the Floyd family, and we stand with all those who are committed to guaranteeing every American the full measure of justice that George and so many others have been denied. Here's Steve Nash with his thoughts. And political commentator and host of the On One podcast. Great title, Angela Rye, also an attorney. Let me mention that as well. Angela, thank you so much for being with us this morning. And I want to start with your initial reaction to the verdict.
Yeah, my initial reaction, I think, like so many of us, was a collective sigh of relief. That finally justice would be served in this case. And I think that State Attorney General Keith Ellison, former member of Congress, said it best when he said this was accountability, which reminds us that we still have a long road to go towards real justice. So many of us put the burden of every case that was not ruled in our favor on Derek Chauvin. And I think that it's reasonable to understand, but you consider that just 10 days ago, Daunte Wright was killed 10 miles from where this trial was taking place. You consider that just minutes before the verdict was even read, Ma'Khia Bryant in Columbus, Ohio, was shot and killed 3 times in the chest. A 16-year-old black girl and the officer had been on the scene apparently for 20 seconds, right? So it's really hard to even see something like the Raiders tweet where they say, "I can breathe." I understand they were referencing George Floyd's brother's comments, but we can't breathe yet. We can't breathe because Eric Garner couldn't breathe, but perhaps his video wasn't long enough. We can't breathe because Manny Ellis, from where I'm from in Washington State, was choked and held down by not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but 5 officers. And there's still no accountability from him. That event happened last March, before George Floyd. Right? And so we can't breathe. We can't relax. We can't allow this one verdict to be justice for every black life who mattered and didn't ever see justice. And perhaps the perpetrators never even saw the inside of a courtroom.
Angela, thank you for being on the show. Let me make a statement and then I'm going to ask you a question because I want to say something to white folks out there that have a difficult time understanding where black folks are coming from when we talk about police brutality or a bit brutality on the part of some law enforcement officials, whatever way you want to say it. Dylan Roof goes and shoots 9 people in a church in South Carolina, and he ends up arrested. Somebody walks into a supermarket in Colorado who's not black. They end up arrested after killing 10 people. But unarmed black folks find themselves dead. That is a very, very difficult thing to comprehend. And so for me, Angela, I bring this question to you. You talk about how we can't drop the ball. We got to stay on it because, okay, we got the verdict. This is just one case. As far as I'm concerned, Angela, this case ain't over. The judge gets to decide how much time this guy is going to get. And that's been the focal point for me since this show started this morning. The judge gets to decide, it's a concurrent sentence because it's a state crime, not federal, so it's going to be served concurrently, not consecutively. As a result, they can go after the 40 years, which is the stiffest penalty, the stiffest charge for the second-degree unintentional murder. But still in all, the judge can sit up there and give them half that. And in the state of Minnesota, if you have no criminal record, which this officer apparently did not, you usually only serve 2/3 of your sentence, which means we're talking about 12 and a half years. We got cats dealing weed that serve more time than that. So I asked the question to you, Angela, how concerned are you and how concerned do you think we should be? As an attorney, knowing what you know, how concerned should we be about this judge and what this judge is going to do in a case like this?
Well, Stephen, you bring up a great point, and I will tell you, most of yesterday afternoon, right after the verdict was read, I was saying the same thing. Like, now we got sentencing. You know, this sentencing hearing will be held the day after Juneteenth, which hopefully for us, knowing that that was our true Emancipation Day, means something good in our favor. But I could totally understand and appreciate the tension, the unreadiness, the uneasiness, and the anxiety that you feel around sentencing. We know that black folks get stiffer penalties and stiffer sentences for far less. And I think that the reality that is before us is this is another teachable moment about how important it is for us to engage in our civic power. What am I talking about? Judges, in so many instances, are elected, right? The ways in which laws are enacted, enforced, are things that can be dictated by who we put into office. And so those are the things that we need to start taking into consideration. They ended up with a good jury. Sometimes, as you know, Stephen A., that's not always the case. Jury duty is a part of your civic power and responsibility as a registered voter. Saying all of that to say, no, we shouldn't just relax. No, we should not brush this aside. Yes, we should be highly concerned about what this judge does in particular, because he decided to address something that Congresswoman Waters said while on the ground in Minneapolis, that people who are supporters of BLM, Black Lives Matter, and protesters should be more confrontational. For whatever reason, in the minds of some scared white folks out here, that sounds like violence. I don't understand why. Confrontation means to me to be sure and clear about where you stand, about making your demands, about ensuring that justice is in fact served. But for whatever reason, this judge in this case, the one that you're so concerned about, rightfully so, chose to bring this up to the defense team when they said that this was grounds for a mistrial, her remarks. So he said to address it on appeal, of course, not necessarily encouraging appeal, but letting them know where this could be addressed. But the fact that he would say it's inappropriate, it gives me great pause. I don't know what he'll do.
The original statement out of Minneapolis was that a man died. By the way, it's nice to see you again, Angela. And good to have you on the show. The original statement out of Minneapolis was that a man died as a result of a medical complication after a police interaction. And then we see the video of what actually happened. So the idea of mistrust from African American toward law enforcement is there's a long history there. There's also a history in this country of disenfranchising and limiting black power, both at the ballot box, starting, obviously starting with slavery, but certainly during Reconstruction and Jim Crow and purging black people from voter rolls and all of that. But now what we also see are the following measures being taken. There's voter suppression, a law just enacted in Georgia. No, it expands voting rights. Yeah, to people in rural areas. It makes it harder for people in urban areas. And there are also in these state legislatures all these anti-protest bills where the idea is that it makes it more difficult to stage the kind of protests with the backdrop of a pandemic in this case, but to stage the kind of protests that raised awareness that probably contributed to a just verdict in this case. What are your thoughts on the kind of organized plans afoot to limit black voices and black power?
Yeah, it's a great question, and Max, it's good to see you too. The first thing I would say is addressing just the point that you raised around a man died, right? So often what we've seen in this country is that even with video, that's not good enough. There was a meme going around on social media last week that said, ain't nothing changed since Rodney King but the video quality, right? And that's something that we really, really have to wrestle with. The fact that ain't nothing changed about oppressive state laws, local ordinances, and federal laws haven't changed much either. The fact that folks who are white supremacists, racist, having some type of implicit bias or discriminatory issue, but a part of the oppressive system, continue to find innovative and creative ways to oppress and suppress not just black power, but the power of a number of people of color and women and folks from the LGBTQIA community. That's not new either. So people are all of a sudden surprised by voter suppression efforts, but they shouldn't be, because there were these same efforts taking place right after the election of Barack Hussein Obama, right? There were more than 140 state legislatures who tried to adopt or enacted voting rights legislation, dialing back of voting rights, ending early voting, cutting back the number of ending absentee voting, cutting back the number of early voting days, making folks have to produce voter ID. Now, it'll be a misdemeanor if you give somebody water at the polls, right? These are the kinds of things that happen when people step into their power just a little bit. Nothing has changed around protesting either. If it wasn't the law in the book, it was the baton on the back of someone's head. The person I'm thinking about right now is John Lewis, who was just fighting to ensure that black people could vote like everyone else.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add this. Thank goodness that Darnella Frazier stepped into her power, the 17-year-old who was threatened by Derek Chauvin. And I mentioned this at the top of the show because I don't think we would have this verdict without having that video. And you shouldn't even have to have the video to begin with, but it is what it is. Angela sticking around here with us. So when we can return here on First Take, I also want to mention this. Jazz star Rudy Gobert shared
a part of injustice that comes to the hands of police brutality and acts like that. And so, we look forward to the sentencing in a couple of months, and hopefully, that brings complete closure for the family and a lot of people in this country. Obviously we have a long way to go as people, as a society here. But today was a start. It was a good day.
Welcome back to First Take. Derek Chauvin found guilty of all 3 charges for his role in the murder of George Floyd. And Angela Rye back here with us. Angela, we know this verdict is where the real work begins. So where do we go from here?
It's a great question. I think a number of places. One, today, the Department of Justice under Merrick Garland's leadership, who of course is the Attorney General, name might be familiar to some of you because he was also a Supreme Court nomination picked by Barack Obama, who the Senate would not confirm. But as the Department of Justice's Attorney General, he is announcing today that there will be a broad sweeping investigations into the Minneapolis Police Department. Very, very important step to take. But we all realize that this is something that has to be a broad sweeping investigation throughout police departments all over the country. Again, mentioning the name of Ma'Khia Bryant, who is the young woman who was shot and killed just yesterday in Columbus, Ohio. Columbus, Ohio would not be a part of the broad sweeping investigation in the Minneapolis Police Department. How do we ensure that broad sweeping investigations, pattern and practice examinations, new standards are built into grant money, whether or not the police departments have access to some of that money? All could be answered with the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. The times where police unions have hid under the cover of qualified immunity would be addressed in the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. We talked about this on the show last time. Why does this matter? This bill was introduced, passed in the House last Congress, right after the killing of George Floyd. It was also introduced in the Senate, died in the Senate. This year, new Congress, Congressmember Qerim Bass, the former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, anchored by all of the members of the CBC, many members of the Tri-Caucus, which include the Hispanic Caucus and the Asian Pacific American Caucus. They all support this bill. This bill passed the House again. Where is it? Sitting in the Senate. Just like today, the Senate has the opportunity to confirm the first ever woman of color as the Assistant Attorney General. First woman to have a civil rights background. Can we see why that might be important in this day and age? That's what's important. Folks can get on the phones today. You breathed a sigh of relief yesterday, perhaps. You're saying that we have further to go. We can't keep saying that without having an idea of what that journey looks like, what that roadmap looks like. It looks like calling the Senate, 202-224-3121. They have a job to do. Pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. They have a job to do. Confirm Vanita Gupta. They have a job to do. Confirm Kristen Clark, the nominee for the Civil Rights Division at DOJ, which again is the Department of Justice. We have a lot that we can do, and we have to stop giving our power away. We can start with making that call.
You know, Angela, I'm listening to you right now, and believe it or not, one of the people that I think about a lot is Hall of Famer, now a commentator and a basketball analyst, Mr. Isaiah Thomas. Isaiah Thomas is the former president of the NBA Players Association in the late 80s and early 90s. And what people what a lot of people don't realize, first of all, I've known Isaiah Thomas for over 30 years. He actually gave me my first interview, Max, of a professional athlete. I was a high school reporter, and he gave me an interview while he was still with the Detroit Pistons. And I remember back at that time, he was fighting for blacks and females to cover the NBA. He was calling out the media industry because he was saying that the black athlete is only seen through the gaze of white males. And he was crucified for it, for amplifying that fact and focusing on the need to make it change. And what a lot of people don't realize is Isaiah Thomas has a lot to do with a lot of blacks being able to cover the sport and address and amplify these issues. So now we fast forward to 2021 with everything that you just said, Angela. You and I both know what the deal is. The fact of the matter is it's going to stay in the Senate, probably ain't going to pass because Mitch McConnell and those boys are running the show on the Senate side as opposed to the House. We understand what that is. So with that being the reality, with everything that you're saying needs to happen, what can actually be done at this particular moment in time, in the weeks and months to come is what I'm talking about, with the Senate, the makeup of the Senate being what it is?
Well, I think that there's one silver lining, and I would disagree slightly on the leadership. At least it's a 50-50 split. And when the Senate has a 50-50 split,
that's true.
We know what it is. Kamala Harris is the tie-breaking vote, right?
Yeah,
so we have that. Here's the challenge, Stephen A., to your point, though. We have some members on the Democratic side of the aisle in the Senate who are very reticent to attach their names to a vote in favor of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. One of those folks is the senator from West Virginia, Joe Manchin, who, he has a lot of power because of where he sits. And this was also the Democratic senator who supported and endorsed Donald Trump. So folks could start by calling him. I am always reluctant to give my power away and say that we are facing an uphill battle. I don't want to lie to people either, but that doesn't mean that things can't change. There were a lot of people who said, Stephen A., me included, that I was very, I don't know how this is going to end up. It's going to be a mistrial. It's going to be a hung jury. I did not think that we were going to end up with him convicted of 3 charges. I did not think we were going to end up there. And so sometimes we end up being wrong. So today, y'all, I'm asking you to prove Stephen A. wrong.
Well, I hope
help get this bill across the finish line. We got to start somewhere. And I hope that people will take it a step further and really understand what can happen on the local and state level, because that's really where the power is in changing law enforcement on the ground.
And I appreciate you answering the question that way. I know we got to go. I mean, Warnock and Loeffler, and Ossoff. I went brain locked for a second. I forgot about the 50-50 split for a second.
Teamwork.
So I apologize.
I got your back.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
And we can all follow Angela's lead and not just talking and actually doing. So to hear more from her, of course, check out her podcast, follow her on social media, a wealth of knowledge. Angela, always a pleasure. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.
The conversation continues after this break. Ryan Clark will join us, and Megan Rapinoe had this reaction to the verdict, sending love and strength to Minnesota today, to the family and community of George Floyd and so many others. Whatever happens, Derek Chauvin killed George. We know this. Let's continue to fight for a world where this doesn't happen. More of this special edition of First Take after a quick break.
Today, we took a step forward. We're actually getting some progress, but on the other hand, it sucks because in order for that to happen, a life had to be sacrificed. And not only was it George Floyd, but the countless others that throughout the years that have gone through these same situations, and it sucks.
Great to have you with us here this morning, or more like this afternoon at this point. Ryan, what was your initial reaction to the verdict?
I think more relief than anything. I've been conditioned, like most of us, like most black people, not only recently, whether it be Jacob Blake, Breonna Taylor, or Trayvon Martin, any of the things that we've had simply since I've been working here or in the league. And you just think back 1955, Emmett Till, you think 1992, Rodney King. So often we've seen that there's no value put on African-American lives, on the lives of black men, on the lives of black women. And that's not only by the people that take those lives, but the courts that decide if they will be held accountable for those things. I cried when I heard the verdict. I looked at my wife and we had the conversation about relief. I was in no way happy. There is in no way time to celebrate someone losing their life, someone getting their life taken by another human. This wasn't a sacrifice. George Floyd wasn't a martyr. He didn't decide to volunteer himself as tribute for the rest of the world to finally get some justice. I think the other thing that we have to remember is that though the jurors had a tough decision to make, from the sense of we have not seen those decisions made in America in that way, this was the only decision. This was being watched by not only every American, this was being watched around the world. And for maybe the last 4 years, especially the last year and a half, America has been the laughing stock of the world. People have looked at us and looked at the dysfunction, looked at the disparity in the way that people are treated, and understood that things here needed to change, and they were not changing. They were actually going in the wrong direction. And so at a time that we're dealing with Dante Wright's death, and at a time that we lose another sister, teenager, shortly after the verdict is handed down, at least for a second, there was some relief. At least for a second, there was some justice. But the jurors are not heroes. The legislation in Minnesota are not heroes. They just finally did what is right and what they are supposed to do. They held Derek Chauvin accountable under the law, and that was their jobs. At least finally, their jobs also coincided with justice and the right thing for black people.
Well, there's been a lot of talk today about reaction and some confusion, I think even internal confusion with individuals, black and white. How am I supposed to react? Like, the way I'm reacting to this doesn't feel right, or I don't feel like celebrating. And I would never tell someone, especially an African-American person, how to feel about a moment like that. I will say that I think symbols are important, and they can be more emotive. Like, they're more emotive issues than giant legislation that has like giant systemic change, right? I mean, criminal justice reform is more important, probably has a greater impact than police interaction with communities of color, right? And yet there's something about this that's emotive. And I think about, it's been talked about today. Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier, and people celebrate it. But wait a minute, we're celebrating a black man being allowed to play at the highest level? It's absurd. That should, but these symbols are important. And even in this case, I think, to me, you look at a situation where, with incontrovertible video evidence, we see a murder occurred. And by the way, jury didn't take long. Came back, it was an open and shut case. Wait, we should celebrate that? But if it makes you feel good as a symbol, whether or not it also indicates, but wait a minute, it only makes you feel good because it's gone wrong so often. It reminds me of what you brought up earlier about the symbolism of Kaepernick kneeling versus Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck, because, not to make some pat kind of, oh, look, there's a similarity. No, because when Kaepernick kneeled, most of white America didn't seem to get it. And what was he kneeling for? Broadly, social injustice. More narrowly, specifically, police interactions with communities of color, police brutality. That's what it was specifically about. And how dare he and now we fast forward half a decade, and the verdict comes down of a white officer kneeling on a black man's neck and murdering him. And now we look back at Kaepernick and think, many people, and think, okay, I get it now. And for the people who still don't get it, guys, I would say that they are marshaling the forces of injustice still as we speak. Legislation out of state legislatures that try to ban protests or limit protests and the like. And I would say that voter suppression laws in Georgia, because they don't like who got elected. And we have to be vigilant about that, and also keep an open mind about people of goodwill who are ignorant or have been misinformed or are otherwise tone deaf, but who can be brought into the fold. I think that's important too.
Yeah. Today certainly isn't justice, but it's accountability. And I know Ryan and Stephen A. will want to respond to you after the break. And I also have a question I want to ask both of them, too. So we'll step aside for a quick minute. I also want to share this with you. NASCAR's Bubba Wallace had this to say on this historic movement: justice served on all counts. Good. Still a ton of work to do. Continue to rest peacefully. George Floyd.
In my eyes, it looks like justice was served. And, hopefully, from this, there becomes a little bit of closure and hopefully continued progress.
More research and that he learned something. What was your take on this whole situation?
Yeah, I think I listened to Max earlier talk about people who may be a little tone deaf, or people who might not be educated as well as other, but who actually have good intentions. I think Mark Davis is intending to show that he wants to be on the right side of this, that he supports those who support George Floyd, that his players who are African Americans, his players who feel like the George Floyd case could affect them, could affect their family members, that understand that they could be that individual lying on the ground underneath Derek Chauvin's knee, that he wants them to know that he has their back. I think part of that is admitting that he needs to learn, but I also think that another part of it could be taking down the tweet. It's okay to say, you know what, I was attempting to support, but if this made the people who I'm intending to support feel a certain way, then I can also say that I made a mistake and let me rectify it. For so long, African-American people and minorities have been told that, you know what, you have to accept a certain level of treatment, that we are going to give you all that we want to give you and only what we want to give you. We can only value you to a certain point. And so I think Mark Davis, understanding the reaction to this tweet, understanding the reaction to these words, knowing how these words historically would affect the African American, the black community, now you could say, you know what, let me show that I'm further on your side by listening. Let me show that I can now understand and make adjustments based off of how things make you feel. And I've heard over and over again, and I've talked to a lot of my white friends and the people that I'm close to who have sent text messages or who have called me to have discussions, to understand further, who were on the side of right initially when George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin, and have the discussion about how things make me feel. Because what Mark Davis will never know is how watching George Floyd take his last breath feels to a black man. He'll never know what it feels like to be nervous every time your son or your daughter gets in a car, every time you think about them having certain interactions with the police department outside of your home, whether you think they're criminals or not. He won't know that. And so part of that is being able to listen, being able to digest, and being able to react accordingly. I understand the initial sentiment. I understand the initial mistake. What I don't understand is not being humble enough to understand that there's a way to rectify that and show even more so than your attempt at the first tweet that you are on the side of the people who support George Floyd, who support his family, and who want to see things changed in America.
Real quick, Ryan, because you referenced something that I said, and I want to give Stephen A. I want to give you time. I completely agree with that sentiment. It's like Black Lives Matter. When a lot of white people first heard that, it said all lives matter. And it had to be explained to them. Yes, Black Lives Matter means parenthetically two. Black lives matter too. Your lives already seem to matter. But that was confusing to people. But I also totally agree with the idea that once you're told that, hey, this is offending people, then don't do a Dan Snyder and double down and say, I'll never change the name. Listen and learn something and respond accordingly.
Go ahead, Joe. We don't have
Stephen
time.
A?
We gotta go to commercial break. I know that. That's why I said I'll wait until they come back.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I didn't hear you. Ryan, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate your perspective. And we'll talk to you soon. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Final thoughts from Stephen A. and Max after this break. And here's what Magic Johnson had to say after the verdict was announced. Thank God, guilty. Justice has been served. We'll wrap up this First Take special in a moment.
It sucks still for George Floyd's family and everybody around him or connected to him. And so that part still sucks.
The George Floyd bill should be passed, and I think we're taking steps in the right direction, but we have a long, long ways to go as a society, especially when it comes to law enforcement and how the black and brown people have been treated historically.
Welcome back to this First Take special. Derek Chauvin found guilty in all 3 charges for the murder of George Floyd. Max, I'll start with you. What are your final thoughts on this historic verdict?
Well, in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, justice postponed is justice denied. And the Emancipation Proclamation did not end racism, nor did Juneteenth, nor nor Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier, nor Brown versus the Board of Ed, nor the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this won't end racism either. This is, as many have pointed out, largely symbolic, but it's a symbol, I think, that came about because against the backdrop of a global pandemic and a lot of social upheaval, people led by black people, but also people of good social conscience, made their voices be heard in the streets and at the ballot box. And while there's still a long way to go, and I know, Stephen A., you point to now you want to see what the judge does in terms of the actual sentencing and what happens in many other cases across the country similar to this one. Because the sense is you wake up every day and nothing ever changes. And many people, and many black people, have lived their entire lives and died in this country basically feeling like around an issue like this, nothing has ever changed. And then you wake up one day, and after a lot of work and suffering, something has changed. And this day, whether or not it has a lasting effect, and we'll see what the verdict, what the sentencing is, feels to me like one of those days, if even only symbolic, that means something.
You know, sometimes, and it's not like we're not justified in feeling that way as black people because of what we have had to endure. But on many, many occasions, people walk around and it's like we haven't made progress. Well, we have made progress, but we still have a long way to go. And situations like this highlight and illuminate how far we still have to go and the kind of things that we have to do to address concerns and to ultimately address change. As black folks, as a member of the black community, that's what we have to continue to do. Highlight and illuminate things when they transpire and fight the good fight to make sure that justice is served and that we speak to the better side of people. And to white folks out there who are tired of hearing arguments about racism and things of that nature, ladies and gentlemen, if you're not racist, if you're not prejudiced, if you're not unfair, if you don't look down on people, if you don't exercise behavior that allows you to feel entitled and like you're above folks and you treat people like they're beneath you, particularly because of the color of their skin and beyond, we're not talking about you. So it should be easier for you to join the fight with those who have been ostracized, marginalized, and demonized and treated negatively. Join hands with them and fight the good fight. It contributes to making us a better society. And that's where the focus should be moving forward.
If it was justice, George Floyd would be alive, but it is accountability. And we now leave you with ESPN's Myron Metcalf with his thoughts on Tuesday's historic verdict. Thanks for being with us.